It was my third week as a ranger in Yosemite, back in '78. Fresh out of the academy, a little green but not too bad at figuring out trails. Plus, let's be honest, who couldn't get used to those views every day? It wasn't the glorious peaks or waterfalls that got me though. I liked the quiet of Yosemite Valley, the way you could hear birds even with the folks milling around, the thick smell of the pines. That was my jam. The weirdness started with Gary. Oh, Gary was a park hand. Been around since like the park opened or something. Anyway, he found me checking the signage on Lower Yosemite Fall Trail. He usually kept to himself, so it was a surprise to see him out of his normal haunts. "Say, Ethan," Gary rasped, voice sounding rusty. "Ever go back behind the falls?" "Nah, not really," I said, adjusting a loose sign. "Not much point when you get this view right here, right?" He cackled, this kind of wet, phlegmy sound. "Maybe not point for everyone," he muttered. "Maybe those falls hide more than water." Before I could ask more than water like what, Gary was gone. He moved quick for an old guy. Weird cat, I thought, chuckling to myself at the old-timer with his cryptic messages. But Gary's words stuck with me. I mean, he wouldn't have said something like that for nothing, right? Yosemite was big. You never knew what critters were lurking in the backcountry. Couple days later, I was taking stock of bear canisters at a campsite when I spotted a figure deeper in the woods. Now, folks wander off all the time, but there was a hunched strangeness to this one. Plus, they moved like they knew what they were doing, like maybe they shouldn't be back there. I shrugged, more on instinct than anything, and headed after them. The trees swallowed us right up, the only sound my boots on the trail and that figure shuffling ahead. Every once in a while they'd glance back. They couldn't see me well in the dim light, but they sensed someone was there. Then, just as quick as they showed up, they were gone, like vanished into thin air. Back at camp, a sinking feeling gnawed at my guts. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my newbie jitters. That same night, though, I couldn't shake the image of what I'd seen, or rather not seen, when the figure glanced back. Instead of eyes, there were just these deep, empty sockets. It wasn't an illusion of light. I knew that much. The next few days went by in a blur. Routine patrols, fixing signs, standard ranger stuff. But those empty eyes haunted me. It's funny how your brain works, isn't it? You think you're tough, all prepared, but then something real weird comes along, and you're back to sleeping with the light on. Me? I couldn't shake this feeling that something was watching me. A presence in the trees, just lurking. I was starting to spook myself. Then came the call late one night. It was Gary on the park radio, his voice shaking like a leaf. "Ethan, it's back. God help me, it's back," he gasped. The thing behind the falls, it took Davy. Who's Davy? I wanted to ask, but then it hit me. Davy was one of the seasonal guys, young kid full of jokes and energy, and now gone. Gary's voice cut through the static, frantic and desperate. "We gotta find him, Ethan, please. I can't let it take anyone else." The line went dead. Adrenaline surged through my veins, fear replaced with a grim determination. Gary wasn't one to blow things out of proportion. Something was wrong. Seriously wrong. It took me half an hour to get to the base of Lower Yosemite Fall. The moon barely cut through the thick canopy of trees, making the forest eerie and disorienting. Gary's pickup sat there, abandoned, headlights still on. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the woods for any sign of him or Davy. My heart pounded in my ears, every rustle a potential threat. "Gary?" I shouted into the dark, but only echoing silence answered me. I moved deeper into the forest, flashlight beam flickering over the trail leading towards the waterfall. Even amidst the panic, I couldn't help but take a breath. The waterfall roared into the night, mist swirling up, catching the moonlight like an ethereal veil, and then a flicker of movement in the mist near the base of the falls. Instinctively, I ducked behind a boulder, my heart pounding a deafening rhythm in my ears. Peeking out, I could make out a dark shape near the water's edge. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin. It moved with a jerky, inhuman grace, its limbs impossibly long and spindly. It stood there for a moment, seemingly unaware of my presence. "Davy?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature whipped around, the movement so fast it almost looked like a glitch in reality. The darkness concealed most of it, but I could still make out its outline. A long, withered body, arms reaching almost to the ground, and where its head should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, featureless expanse. The creature lurched toward me, its movements jerky and unsettling. A wave of nausea washed over me as a stench like rotting flesh flooded the air. I raised my flashlight, the beam hitting the creature square in its chest, but it seemed unfazed. It moved so fast I barely had time to react. I felt a sharp blow to my hand, sending my flashlight spinning into the darkness. Pain exploded in my wrist. A bone-chilling shriek pierced the air as the creature lunged. I scrambled backwards, my eyes desperately searching the darkness for my flashlight. I tripped over a root, landing hard, the creature's hot, fetid breath washing over me. I fumbled in the dark, finally finding the flashlight. Hitting the power switch, I directed the beam right at the creature. An ear-splitting shriek reverberated through the forest, and the creature recoiled, its skin burning where the beam hit it. I grabbed hold of a fallen branch and swung, my clumsy blow making contact with the creature's shoulder. It let out another chilling scream, stumbling back with a force that shook the ground beneath me. Time seemed to slow down as I stumbled for my dropped gun, fingers fumbling like I'd never handled a weapon before. The stench of decay was overwhelming, making me gag. Finally, my hand closed around the grip, my trembling fingers flicking the safety off. The creature was regaining its footing, its form blurring in the darkness as it lunged again. I fired once, twice, the deafening shots echoing through the forest. The creature screeched, a sound that made my blood run cold, then staggered backwards, clutching at its chest where the bullets had pierced its withered flesh. With every step it took, a dark, viscous trail followed. A flicker of light caught my eye. Gary. He was stumbling out of the woods, clutching at a makeshift torch and a rifle. "Ethan, behind you," he yelled, his voice hoarse. I spun around, but the creature had vanished. The only trace it had left behind was the inky liquid seeping into the ground. Gary lowered his rifle, his breath ragged. "That thing," he gasped. "It ain't natural, Ethan. I know, Gary." The events of the night crashing over me like a wave. We made our way back to the pickup, the silence broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. I felt a strange hollowness inside of me, like something fundamental had shifted within. Gary slumped into the driver's seat, exhaustion etched on his face. "Gotta get word out," he muttered. "More Rangers. Need backup. Can't let it take others." He started the engine, the headlights slicing through the darkness. As we pulled away, I couldn't help but look back at the base of the falls. The mist danced and swirled, concealing whatever secrets might lay hidden within. The rest is a blur. The frantic radio calls, the arrival of a full team of Rangers, and the search that lasted days. We found Davy's remains tucked into an unseen crevice near the falls, his body torn apart. The creature, however, vanished without a trace. It was as if it had been swallowed by the very earth itself. Officially, the case was filed as an animal attack, but I knew, we all did, that what lurked in Yosemite's shadow was something far more sinister. Gary retired soon after. They say he moved up north, someplace remote. Some say the guilt was too much for him. Others whisper he hunts the creature still, obsessed with vengeance for his lost crewmen. As for me, they put me on leave, said I needed a break from the stress. Truth is, I'd seen things nobody should ever have to witness, and it changes a person. Years passed. I did go back to Yosemite eventually. I couldn't stay away from the mountains, but it was never the same. There's a chill in the air, a quiet late at night when the wind whispers through the pines. I swear I hear a shriek in the distance, a hollow, chilling sound that makes my blood run cold. The locals started whispering about the Shrieker of the Falls, a creature of shadow and myth. They tell tales of hikers vanishing into the mist, snatched by something unseen and monstrous. I stay silent, knowing the awful truth behind the legend. Maybe one day that thing will resurface from whatever dark hole it crawled into, and maybe one day I'll be there to stop it. I owe Davy at least that much. Until then, All I can do is listen to those chilling whispers on the wind and remember the night I faced the unfathomable and barely survived. My name is Daniel Skyhawk, 41 years old, and this happened to me back in 1994. I was living in a small, dusty town in northern Arizona, trying to scrape together a living after leaving the reservation. I worked at jobs, mostly in construction and landscaping. One day, I got a call from my buddy, Frank Tallman, about a gig fixing up an old cabin out in the middle of nowhere. The pay was decent, and I needed the money, so I agreed to help him out. The cabin was owned by a guy named John Stillwater, who had inherited it from his grandfather. John was a wiry man in his 50s, with a graying beard and a rough demeanor. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was with a sharp, no-nonsense tone that made it clear he wasn't one for small talk. We met at a diner on the edge of town to go over the details. "This place hasn't been touched in decades," John said, sipping his black coffee. "It's falling apart, but I want to restore it. You and Frank think you can handle it?" "Yeah, we've seen worse," Frank replied, glancing at me with a smirk. Frank was always the confident one, always ready to take on the next big project without hesitation. "Good. We'll head out tomorrow. It's about an hour's drive into the woods. You guys need anything, you let me know. But fair warning, it's pretty isolated out there. No self-service, no neighbors." "Sounds perfect," I said, trying to match Frank's enthusiasm. The next morning, we loaded up Frank's truck with tools and supplies and followed John's. The road quickly turned from pavement to dirt, winding through thick forest. The trees grew denser, and the sunlight struggled to break through the canopy. It felt like we were driving into another world. We finally arrived at the cabin, and John wasn't kidding when he said it was falling apart. The roof had holes, the walls were covered in moss, and the porch sagged under its own weight. But there was something about the place that felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air seemed heavier, the forest quieter. We got to work right away, tearing down the rotten boards and hauling debris. John mostly stayed out of our way, occasionally checking in to make sure we were on track. As the days passed, that strange feeling persisted. I noticed it in small things. A sudden drop in temperature, the way the trees seemed to close in around us, the eerie silence that settled over the cabin every evening. One night, after a long day of work, Frank and I were sitting on the porch, sipping beers and talking about nothing in particular. John had gone back to town to get more supplies, leaving us alone. "Hey, Charlie, you ever feel like you're being watched out here?" His voice low and serious. I nodded. "Yeah, it's weird, right? This place just feels wrong. Maybe it's just the isolation. We're not used to being this far from civilization." "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker and more menacing. We decided to call it a night and headed inside. The cabin had no electricity, so we relied on lanterns and flashlights. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling of unease that clung to me. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the wall outside. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scraping, like something was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and nudged Frank awake. "Frank, you hear that?" "Hear what?" He mumbled, still half asleep. "Listen." We both sat in silence, and the scraping came again. Frank's eyes widened, and he reached for his knife. "Stay here," he whispered, moving towards the door. "Are you crazy? We should wait until John gets back. We can't just sit here and do nothing. What if it's an animal trying to get in?" I reluctantly followed Frank to the door, flashlight in hand. We stepped outside, the cold night air biting at our skin. The forest was eerily quiet, and the moon cast long shadows across the ground. Every snap of a twig underfoot, sounding like a gunshot in the silence. As we rounded the corner, my flashlight beam caught something moving near the wall. I froze, the light illuminating a figure hunched over, scratching at the wood with long, gnarled fingers. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. my voice trembling. The figure turned its head, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Its eyes were dark, empty voids, and its skin was pale and leathery. It let out a low, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. Frank didn't hesitate. He lunged at the creature with his knife, but it moved with an unnatural speed, darting away into the shadows. We stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what we had just seen. His voice shaky. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now." We hurried back inside, barricading the door as best we could. We sat there in the darkness, clutching our makeshift weapons, waiting for the dawn. Neither of us got any sleep that night, and when John returned the next morning, we told him everything. John listened quietly, his expression grim. "You're not the first to see it," he said finally. "My grandfather used to tell stories about a creature that roamed these woods. He called it the Hatalii, the witch doctor. Said it was a spirit that could take on different forms, and it fed on fear." Frank and I exchanged uneasy glances. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We finish the job and get out of here." John replied, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in getting paid." We continued working on the cabin, but the atmosphere was tense. Every sound, every shadow put us on edge. We never saw the creature again, but we could feel its presence lurking just out of sight. One evening, as we were packing up for the day, Frank went to check on the generator we'd been using for power tools. He didn't come back. I waited, calling his name, but there was no response. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to find him. The generator was still running, but Frank was nowhere to be seen. I called out again, my voice echoing through the trees. Panic set in as I searched the area, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I ran back to the cabin, heart racing. "John, Frank's gone." John grabbed his rifle and followed me outside. We searched the woods, calling Frank's name, but it was no use. As the sun set, the forest grew darker and more foreboding. We had no choice but to return to the cabin and wait until morning. That night was the longest of my life. Every creak, every rustle, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever took Frank was out there, waiting for its next move. At first light, we resumed our search. Hours turned into days, but there was no trace of Frank. The authorities were called, and a formal search was conducted. But it yielded nothing. Frank Tolman had disappeared without a trace. With heavy hearts, John and I finished the work on the cabin. We didn't speak much, the weight of Frank's disappearance hanging over us. When the job was done, I packed up my things and left that cursed place behind. Years have passed since then, but I still think about Frank. I wonder what happened to him, if he's still out there somewhere, or if the Hatalii got him. I've told this story to a few people, but most don't believe me. They say it's just a tale, a figment of my imagination. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Some nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows seem to move, I think back to that cabin in the woods. I think of Frank and the creature with the empty eyes. And I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. My name is Andrew Thunderbird, 35 years old, and this story is from a year that feels like a lifetime ago. I was born and raised in the small town of Wellesley, Massachusetts. Not much happens here, which is why what I'm about to tell you is even more bizarre. It started innocuously enough. I was fresh out of college, back in my hometown, working a dead-end job at the local hardware store. Not exactly the life I'd envisioned, but hey, it paid the bills. My girlfriend Lacey had just moved in with me. We were both trying to save up for something better, but at least we had each other. One evening, my buddy Owen called. "Bryce, you up for a camping trip this weekend?" Just the guys like old times. Owen always had a knack for pulling me out of my funk. "Sure, why not?" I replied. I figured a weekend in the woods might clear my head. Friday rolled around and we packed up Owen's beat-up truck with all the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, food, and a decent stash of beer. It was me, Owen, Kyle, and Benny. We headed out to a spot in the Berkshires, a place we'd camped a few times before. It was quiet and far from the hassles of daily life. We got there just before dusk, set up camp, and lit a fire. The night was filled with laughter and stories. It was like we were kids again, with no responsibilities, no worries. Around midnight, I decided to hit the sack. The others were still up, talking and joking. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I heard I could hear their voices fading into the background, mingling with the sounds of the forest. I woke up to silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. I checked my watch, 3 a.m. I sat up and noticed that Owen, Kyle, and Benny were all fast asleep. I stepped out of the tent to stretch my legs and take a leak. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. As I stood there, I heard a rustling noise in the trees. Probably a deer or some other animal, I thought. But then I saw it. A shadowy figure moving among the trees. It was tall, hunched over, and moving with an unsettling grace. My first thought was that it was a bear, but something about its shape was all wrong. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. The figure stopped, turned towards me, and then vanished into the darkness. My heart was racing, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I finished up and went back to the tent, though sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I told the guys about what I'd seen. Owen laughed it off. "You probably had one too many beers. Nothing out here but us and the wildlife." The others agreed, and we went about our day, hiking and exploring the area. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were sitting around the fire again, talking about old times, when we heard a blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a woman, but there was something primal about it, something that chilled me to the bone. "What the hell was that?" Kyle asked, his face pale. Benny, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's Bigfoot, or worse, Kyle's ex-girlfriend." We laughed nervously, but the tension was palpable. We decided to check it out, grabbing flashlights and heading in the direction of the scream. The woods were dense, and the beams of our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. After about 10 minutes, we came across a small clearing. In the middle of it was a deer, or what was left of one. It had been torn apart, its insides strewn across the grass. "Oh my God," Benny whispered. "What could have done this? Mountain lion, maybe," Owen suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We heard another rustle in the trees, and all our flashlights swung towards the sound. The figure was back, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was taller than I'd realized, easily 7 feet, with long matted hair and glowing eyes that reflected the light from our flashlights. The creature let out a low, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. We didn't stop until we were back at the fire, panting and wide-eyed. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Agreed," Owen said. "Let's pack up and leave. Now." We scrambled to gather our things, tossing them haphazardly into the truck. The forest around us seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. Just as we were about to get in the truck, Benny screamed. We turned to see the creature standing at the edge of the campsite, its eyes locked onto us. Without thinking, I grabbed the hatchet from my pack and hurled it at the creature. It let out a roar and retreated into the woods. And Owen didn't need to be told twice. We sped down the dirt road, the truck bouncing over the rough terrain. The moonlight flickered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the windshield. We drove for what felt like hours until we reached a small town. We found a diner that was still open and stumbled inside, disheveled and shaken. The waitress, an older woman with a kind face, looked at us with concern. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring us coffee. "Something like that," I muttered. We told her a sanitized version of what had happened, just enough to explain why we were so rattled. She listened, nodding occasionally. "You know, there are old legends about these woods," she said. "Stories of creatures that aren't quite human. Most folks dismiss them as just that, stories, but you never know. We spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, too afraid to sleep. The next morning we drove back to Wellesley in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We never spoke about that night again, not really. It was like an unspoken pact, a way to keep the fear at bay. Lacey noticed a change in me right away. "Bryce, what happened out there?" she asked one night as we lay in bed. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a weird trip. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. None of us were. Owen moved to another state a few months later, saying he needed a fresh start. Kyle and Benny drifted away, their laughter and jokes now tinged with an edge of unease. As for me, I stayed in Wellesley, but I never went camping again. I sold my gear, got a new job, and tried to put that night behind me. But sometimes late at night I still hear that scream. And I wonder what it was that we saw out there in the woods. Life went on as it does, but the shadows of that night never entirely left me. I married Lacey, and we had 2 kids. I took up woodworking, finding solace in the rhythm of carving and shaping. The routine helped, but the memory lingered. One evening, years later, I was working in my garage when Owen called out of the blue. "Bryce, we need to talk." We met at a bar halfway between our towns, the kind of place where no one asked questions. More worn than I remembered. We ordered beers and sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. "I can't stop thinking about it," Owen finally said. "That night. I've tried to move on, but it's always there like a shadow." I nodded. "Same here. What do you think it was?" Owen took a deep breath. "I don't know, but I've been doing some research. There are stories, old legends about creatures in those woods. They say it's something ancient, something that preys on people who wander too far." I shivered, remembering the creature's eyes. "So what do we do?" Owen shrugged. "I don't think there's anything we can do. Just live our lives, I guess." But I had to talk to someone who understands. We stayed there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, trying to make sense of the senseless. It didn't bring closure, but it helped to know I wasn't alone in my fear. As the years passed, the memory of that night faded but never disappeared. I grew old, watching my children grow up and start families of their own. I told them stories about my youth, but I never mentioned that night in the britches. Then one evening my son Max, now a grown man with a family of his own, came to visit. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset, and he turned to me with a serious expression. "Dad, do you remember that camping trip you went on years ago? The one you never talk about?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah, I remember." Max nodded. "I've been doing some research. There are stories about those woods, stories that go back centuries. People talk about seeing things, hearing screams. I think you saw something real, something that shouldn't be there." I looked at him, my heart heavy with the weight of old fears. "Maybe, but there's no point in dwelling on it. We survived, and that's what matters." Max nodded, but I could see the curiosity and determination in his eyes. "I just wanted you to know that I believe you, Dad. Whatever it was, you're not alone." As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. Maybe the past would never fully let go, but I had my family and that was enough. Life is full of mysteries, some better left unexplored. I don't have all the answers and maybe I never will, but I've learned to live with the shadows, to find light in the moments that matter. And that's enough for me.